Good evening. It's so great to see y'all here tonight. I feel like I'm back in the South for a minute there. Welcome to the 2014 American Democracy Lecture, sponsored by the Center for Public Humanities and the Department of History. We're very excited tonight to get in on a conversation with Dr. Philip Deloria, but I promised Jim LeGrand I wouldn't say a word about Philip Deloria, so he gets the pleasure. But we have had a fabulous day with him, and I'm excited to extend the conversation this evening. But I did want to take a second to tell you a little bit about the Center for Public Humanities. Thanks to a lot of hard work on a lot of people that came before me and before many of us here, the Center for Public Humanities is supported by a matching grant with the National Endowment for the Humanities and a lot of generous donors, friends of the college, and local community organizations and foundations that are committed to the belief, like we are, that the humanities the study of the human experience is a broad and enduring and very worthy area of study. And we're so fortunate that we have the luxury of carving out time and spaces with lots of different conversation partners on campus, but also in the community. We have several programs that that the Center for Public Humanities supports. One is a program of humanities-based courses that offer college credit, and it's taught at Downey School, and it's for people who haven't had the opportunity to go to college yet. It's a great group of students every year because it's people that are bringing lived experiences and really engaged ways of thinking about big ideas that we talk about here all the time, but they bring a whole nother world and life to those big ideas, and it's such a wonderful experience. We have professors, we have students here tonight that are currently enrolled in the program, and we have alumni here with us tonight, and we're very glad to have all of you with us. We also offer another program called the Teachers to Scholars Summer Seminars, and if you're a middle school or high school teacher, you may be interested in finding more out about that program, or if you're a middle school or high school student, tell your teachers about the Teachers to Scholars Summer Seminars, and you can find out more about that if you go to messiah.edu/CPH. We also offer high school competitions in the spring. We host the Speech and Debate Day and History Day. And every year, we offer the American Democracy Lecture, which is alternately sponsored by the Department of History and the Philosophy Department. In the spring, we have the Humanities Symposium, which is a week-long, incredibly rich conversation on a theme that we choose the year before. This year, the theme is Race in America. And we can't think of a better way to get our conversation started on that than having Dr. Philip Deloria talk to us about Indian Americans and the American imagination. So we're excited that this is our first event to begin our year-long conversation on race in America. Thank you so much for being with us. I'm so sorry, but I forgot a very important announcement. We are so uptown. So if you want to tweet about the lecture tonight, you can use the Twitter handle at MC_PubHum. That's the Twitter handle. And the hashtag is MC Democracy. So you tweeters, go to town, okay? Thank you very much.
Thanks, Jean, and let me also welcome everyone here this evening. So glad to be able to speak for both the Department of History as well as the Center for Public Humanities in welcoming Dr. Philip Deloria to his campus and to introduce him before he delivers the 2014 American Democracy Lecture. Dr. Deloria is the Carol Smith Rosenberg Professor of History as well as the Associate Dean for Undergraduate and Graduate Education at the University of Michigan. And he also comes from a most important and influential Dakota family. And some of us earlier today have been hearing about this and reading some pieces he wrote on this. His great-grandfather and grandfather among the earliest Native American leaders within the Episcopal Church and his father, Vine Deloria Jr., a prominent author, scholar, leader, and activist, particularly in the 1960s and 70s. Now, if you were to look at either Dr. Deloria's own CV or to be able to engage him in conversation, and we all had a wonderful day today with him, I think one of the things that would strike you is what a Renaissance man he is. He has a PhD, holds a PhD in American Studies from Yale, a master's in journalism and mass communications from the University of Colorado, and a bachelor's in music education, also from the University of Colorado. And we found out just yesterday that Dr. Deloria continues to put his music education degree to good use. I think we would expect those of us who work around, who teach at colleges and universities, would expect that deans at places like the University of Michigan, they'd have some power over things like budgets and personnel. But we found that Dr. Deloria also has used his position in ways that I think to most of us sound like they're more fun. In addition to processing piles of paperwork and attending meetings, deans sometimes get to do things like developing a new class, and you might expect that part of the perks of being a dean is you get to sort of fast track that new class onto the course schedule without a lot of delay. And Dr. Deloria has done that just this semester. Currently, I guess he's apart from his students for these 2 days, but he's in the midst of teaching a course on songwriting to undergrads at University of Michigan. So certainly a man of many, many talents. But he's best known for his wide-ranging work and writings in American Indian history and culture. The author of Indians in Unexpected Places, published by University of Kansas Press in 2004, Playing Indian by Yale University Press in 1998, Blackwell Companion to Native American History, edited with Neil Salisbury in 2002, and also an edited collection, Black Elk Speaks, the complete edition, along with many, many articles and essays. And in this work, and I'm sure that in his presentation tonight, Dr. Deloria explores issues of individual and collective identities and what happens when these various identities bump into each other and intersect. A most American story in some ways. And he explores issues of representation, of race relations, racial boundaries, and imagery. And throughout all this work, Dr. Deloria weaves both theoretical sophistication into vivid and compelling narratives. Dr. Deloria's lecture tonight is entitled American Indians and the American Cultural Imagination. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Philip Deloria.
So I have to say, over the years, I've done a lot of talks in a lot of places. I'm not sure I've ever been in a place as cool as this. What a fantastic space. I'm really, really feel very fortunate to be here. Jean, thank you. Jim, thank you. Shirley, thank you for being patient with my bad email etiquette and all of those kinds of things. And thank you all for coming. I could not be more pleased and honored to be here. So I'm quite grateful. This goes kind of fast. So are you ready? We do the rock and roll introduction. Are you ready, Messiah? Come. We do the formal rock and roll introduction. Are you ready, Messiah? Yeah. Okay, here we go. Why is there an Indian figure named Freedom on the top of the nation's capital? Why is the Boston Tea Party such a compelling icon in United States history? Why is Pocahontas such a big deal? Why do we have Sacagawea on dollar coins? What kind of identity crisis was the great American singer Cher going through when she moved away from gypsies, tramps, and thieves, started working with the Indian themes found in Half-Breed? Does anyone know this song? Yes, okay, good, yeah. Whoa. It's a kind of wonderful song. It's got this kind of great Indian... Yeah. Very minor keys. Half-breed, that's all I ever heard. Half-breed. Yeah, that was Cher, at her best. Why have Americans built hotels and movie theaters meant to evoke pueblos? Why do so many people have those dream catchers dangling from their rearview mirrors? Why do we have motorcycles and sports teams named after Indians? And let's just imagine 4 of the most recent manifestations of Indians in American popular culture. Werewolves, right? Little blue people with telepathic tales. Johnny Depp discovering his Comanche heritage. And of course, the hipster kind of thing, where everybody gets to wear a headdress when they, when they want to. And this one, sent to me by my friend Michael Innes Jimenez last year, the category of weird stuff that we just don't understand. Why powwow for power, and how does a plug-in thing become a headdress? It's all mysterious to me. So we could ask a million similar questions, because when you go looking, you find that Indians are omnipresent in American popular and high culture, rising and falling across in popularity across a huge sweep of time. And once you identify this proliferation of Indians, you have to ask yourself, well, why? What's this about? What does it mean that Indians seem so curiously central to American history and culture, particularly given the fact that even in the current moment, right, American Indians make up slightly more than 1% of the American population? Well, this is an old and ancient question, one that goes back to the Big Bang that gave us this nation. In 1924, when D.H. Lawrence completed his sometimes wacky but often insightful studies in classic American literature, he put Indians at the heart of the contradictions that for him embodied America. Indians represented instinct and freedom. They spoke for the spirit of the continent. They were the wild thing against which civilization might define itself. And yet, that Indian wildness was the very thing Americans desired in order to somehow make themselves whole. So where do these contradictions come from? Well, tonight I want to make a quick tour of some of the various origin points and the explanations concerning the place of Indian people in American culture. In the iconography of the 16th and 17th centuries, the Americas frequently appeared as an Indian and often as an Indian woman. So here's an image, it's called Vespucci Waking America, that encapsulates some of these old original ideas. America is sleeping, her potential untapped, and she's surrounded by these curiously sloth-like animals. If you look at those animals, they're all like little sloths, right? She seems destined to always be a little bit lazy and backward. The human inhabitants are savages, demonstrated most notably in their proclivity for cannibalism. If you kind of look over her shoulder, you see them roasting a leg over an open fire. Vespucci himself stands surrounded by the advanced technologies and beliefs of Europe, transatlantic ships, navigational tools, and of course, Christianity. In contrast to Vespucci's overdressed appearance, America is naked, evoking visions of an innocent garden before the fall. But America's nakedness, and this is a continuous theme in these kinds of images, also suggests a relation between sexual availability and colonial domination. The Indian woman is available to the sexual desires of European men in the same way that the continent is available to their colonial kinds of desires. It's like an old SAT question kind of form. In the Middle Years, thank you for that small chuckle. You're totally licensed to do that, and you can Twitter anytime you feel like it. I mean, tweet. You can tweet anytime you feel like it. I'll give you a few tweeting cues later on, actually. In the years of the middle 18th century, both Europeans and American colonists used Indians to represent not just the New World itself, but the very precise politics of the American colonies. So here, for example, you can see in a British image the struggle netted out quite clearly. The half-naked Indian princess, America, cries for liberty, while Britannia responds, "I'll force you to obedience, you rebellious slut." Colonists, colonists up and down the coast had long histories of conflict with Indian people, which took shape in beliefs about Indian savagery, and those beliefs retained much of their power. But as they tried to imagine a new nation, Americans increasingly came to identify themselves with Indians and in opposition to the British. And this required a certain rethinking of ideas about Native people. In the years leading up to the Revolution, colonists frequently portrayed themselves as Indians in political cartoons and handbills. By a ratio of 4-to-1, one scholar has calculated, Indians represented the colonies more frequently than snakes, pine trees, liberty ladies, and other more familiar icons. The Indian was still often a woman and usually a princess. This royalty thing is important here. And the same connotations of sexual violence were now turned upside down as colonists insisted that they themselves were the victims of a metaphorical rape. One of the best examples of this new elevation of Indians was the founding of the so-called St. Tammany Societies. Tammany was, by all accounts, a native leader who had sold land to William Penn. As early as the 1730s, however, elite Philadelphians had started to create myths about Tammany and to attach them to their hunting and fishing clubs, which should be in parentheses, hunting and fishing and drinking clubs, right? And they liked to sing songs when they were in their cups. In this nascent national folk literature, Tammany emerged as a kind of 18th century Indian American superhero. After the passage of the Stamp Act in 1765, the members began calling their hunting groups Tammany Societies, and they promoted Tammany from being a kind of mythic figure to being the king of America, and then finally to being the national patron saint. They wrote songs that compared the national saints of the constituent colonies of the British Empire, such as this one here. I don't know the melody of this song, or I would ask the dean to sing it. Because, Pete, I hear you have a fine singing voice. But you can see what's happening here, right? Sort of, Ireland, Scotland, and Wales, each being linked to different kinds of food, potatoes, oaks, and leeks. These things make for subservient colonies, right, in a song like this. But free-roaming venison and squirrel means freedom in kind of the most literal animal sense of the world and of 18th century environmentalism, particularly in relations to the social restrictions on hunting, right, that Europeans felt that they were suffering. Now, Philadelphians and Bostonians did not simply imagine an American Indian as a national saint. They put on clothes and costumes and they paraded through the streets, performing as Indian in order to stake their claim to being Americans. So as I have argued, they played Indian in order to assert a dawning sense of themselves as free Americans rather than dominated British colonists. Because who, after all, was more tied to this continent than Indians? So when colonists dressed Indian, celebrated Tammany as an American saint, suggested that their resistance to British authority was part of a kind of environmental imperative for freedom, they laid claim to an aboriginal kind of status. But at the same time, Indianists also continued to suggest savagery, lawlessness, being on the wrong side of the social order, and as such, they made perfect symbols for the kind of transgression of social order, right? The breaking down of social boundaries and laws represented by the Boston Tea Party and by the Revolution itself. You can tweet this if you'd like. No, not this, just the part about the book. So we had a long discussion in the class earlier today about humility. So one might ask, well, what was so terribly awful about this book? What was so terrible about this? So some part of it was, in fact, yes, a little bit of theorizing that I did on page 21 and 22. And, this was kind of late 80s, early 90s when we did this kind of theoretical stuff. And it was a little bit of tough sledding, I suppose, but it was actually in some ways the payoff to the whole argument. And so I ask you, are you willing to join me for just a few moments of this? Okay, thank you. Good, because I've got a PowerPoint. There's no way out of it, actually. We so often discuss Euro-American ideas about Indians using the term noble savage, right? It's the kind of go-to term. It reflects two familiar sets of ideas. Indians are either noble citizens of nature, pure ecologists, happy communitarians, deeply spiritual, or they are savage, cannibalistic, backward, primitive, and so on and so forth. And these ideas were clearly at play during the Revolution as they are today. But the situation seems to me to be somewhat more complicated because the noble part of the savage, noble savage, is a measurement of value, right? Good or bad, on a scale that essentially only has two positions. But when Americans began trying to see themselves in terms of Indians and then acting and performing that, it seems to me we need to start thinking of another measure, which is a measure of relative distance. So forget noble and savage for a moment and think of Indians as being either so distant from an American self that they might as well be inhuman. Right? This is not the same thing as imagining them as savages, or being so close that a figure like Tammany could be interchangeable with your average American patriot. And this is not the same thing as imagining them as noble, right? These are sort of different, slightly different kinds of things. Now, it seems to me that this schema allows us maybe to take a more complicated look at this Indian thing, try to understand it more thoroughly. There are, of course, natural affinities between these two different kinds of scales. Right? Thinking of Indians as inhumanly distant from yourself is easy when you think of them as being savage. Likewise, thinking of Indians as noble makes it easy to see yourself in them. But there's other possibilities. You might also, for example, imagine an Indian that was both savage and close to you, like a fierce and canny warrior, right? Like a Tea Party rebel or a revolutionary soldier shooting from behind the rocks and trees like an Indian. Remember that narrative about the revolution too, right? The British march around in their red coats and they march right up, and the smart Americans hide between rocks and trees, and the British can't quite figure that out. They don't know what's going on because, oh, the Americans are acting like, yeah, they're acting like Indians. You might then imagine an Indian that was both noble and distant, right? And I think this is a very modern conceit, that Indians in all their noble purity somehow exist outside the modern world. And using this line of distance allows us to put some tighter definitions around the whole question. We make identity by finding ourselves in relation to an array of people and objects who are not ourselves. Every person, everything is other to us in multiple ways. And these differences are part of the line, or really lines, because there are an infinite number of them, I think, of distance. And on these lines, we situate some others quite closely to the selves that we want to call into being, and others we place at such a distance as to be inhuman. And then we bisect this scale with categories of relative distance. So my sister is other to me, but she's relatively close. That's the category we call family. A resident of Ann Arbor is farther away. That's a category we might call community, but not as far away as someone from the Midwest. That's a category we might call region, or Europe, the category we might call continent, or another planet, right? And you can see how it goes and goes. Men are closer to me in some ways than women, egghead intellectuals closer to me than soldiers, right? And I could go on, spewing out an infinite number of kinds of difference, but I don't really need to, right? Because I think you get the point. Our familiar sense of social divisions, race, gender, class, sexuality, ethnicity, region, nationality, profession, all these things help us to categorize, to clarify, and empower this web, this myriad of relations. These categories let us define ourselves both individually and collectively. And in fact, many of these lines work best when they function not around an individual, but around a group that can solidify these kinds of things. And one of the most powerful lines that can be drawn across this spectrum is that which delineates the nation. Nationalism links environment, political identity, and group destiny together, creating close insiders, citizens, right, fellows, and more distant outsiders. We see its power in the news every day. And so now finally to the point. More than any other group in American history, Indians have been tightly linked with the particular lines that have defined our nation. Indianness has been an evocative way to think about nation, freedom, and land. And one might make a parallel argument, right, that blackness has been equally important to American anxieties about different things, about labor, sexuality, self-expression, these kinds of things. But when it comes to the nation, Indians have been a primary thinking tool for us as Americans. So, why is Pocahontas such a big deal? Well, you know, in saving one European and marrying another, Pocahontas moves, in effect, from distant Indianness to close Americanness, and her story becomes a founding myth of the American nation itself. If George Washington is the father of the nation, doesn't Pocahontas have a good claim to being its mother? She knits together nation, land, freedom to choose, and her myth serves as a template for any number of other stories. Sacagawea, who helped Lewis and Clark open up half the continent while giving birth to a mixed-blood child, has developed similarly mythic meanings. Of course, she belongs on our national coinage, and of course, there's an Indian princess on the nation's capital bearing the name Freedom. Well, Americans had to come to terms with these contradictions, the contradictions of the national enterprise. On the one hand, they had used Indians to help build a sense of national identity during the Revolution. On the other hand, the nation's strength was everywhere turned toward the domination of American Indian people, because the United States was built quite literally on the conquest of Indian land. White Americans imagined Indians as both distant savages to be conquered and as close American selves to be experienced. To build this nation, Indians had to be devalued and dispossessed, yet to continue being American and not British, Indians had at the same time to be valued and claimed and made part of a whole. And this contradiction was built into the heart of American identity, and it has never gone away. It's never gone away.